OWS fam, the nation, my dudes and dudettes. Hilow here, bringing you another installment of the 1 week season Best Ball Plus Industry Experts series. You know the drill by now. These will be released to YouTube every Friday. If you're interested in what you see here, head on over to 1 week season, sign up for the Best Ball Plus product at a reduced rate now, because we are doing this 5 days a week, and we are heavy on the theoretics, heavy on the analytics, and we are trying to train your decision-making process to make better decisions in a best ball draft. My guest this week, you see it on the screen, Josh Lee of the Undroppables. Josh is the head of analytics over at the Undroppables. He also just launched his own company. He is the co-founder of Faro Analytics, which is a sports betting and analytics platform. And Josh caught my attention on Twitter, which basically prompted me to reach out to him to see if he wanted to come on and jam with us here at 1 week season. Josh, how we doing today, brother?
It's going really great today, Hilow. Really appreciate you having me on the show. I'm excited.
Yeah, dude. You guys are, well, I guess you in particular, obviously having founded your own analytics company, head of analytics over at Undroppables. You are very analytically driven, very data sciencey. That's not a word, but we'll go with it. So I thought this would be a very, very natural pairing for us to talk, where we can kind of blend the theoretics and the analytics and see what can come of it through the lens, I guess, of best ball strategy and theory and all that good stuff. So really stoked to talk to you today. And the first thing, we've kind of mentioned it twice already, but the first thing that I really want to talk to is you developed a model for the Best Ball Mania 4 over on Underdog. And I know that we're recording this on Monday, so by the time this is released, your model is going to be live on Undroppables. Is that correct?
Yes. The model's output will be posted to the Undroppables website at theundroppables.com. It'll have its own sheet. It'll have its own webpage. It'll live on its own. And you guys can all benefit for free the output of the model.
For free?
For free. This is stuff that I spent a lot of time working on, but I'm giving it to the people, giving it to you guys for free.
Man of the people, you heard it here first. Head on over to Undroppables, shout out there, and check out Josh's model. Let's talk a little bit about that model. And I want to talk, I guess, anchor on really the process and the inputs of your model. What did you find important through your research when building this model? And what were you trying to accomplish as far as actionable strategy points through the outputs?
Of course. So obviously it started just as an exercise, just because there's $3 million at the top of Best Ball Mania.
Yeah, money. Shout out.
Money. It's going to be a worthwhile exercise, at least I thought it was going to be. So I was building a submission for the Best Ball Data Bowl, launched by the Fantasy Data Pros, and had read through Mike Leone's Best Ball Manifesto. I'm on Twitter a lot, and so I see all of the different concepts for how you can maximize your points in Best Ball Mania. Saw stacking, roster construction, ADP value, all that good stuff. But as I was doing my digging, the thing that kept popping out to me was that the actual players themselves are what's driving a lot of the different strategies. We saw zero RB as being the optimal strategy last year. You should have waited until the seventh, eighth round to draft your first running back, and that was because Josh Jacobs, Tony Pollard, Ramondre Stevenson was available back. So I was thinking to myself, okay, how do I build a model to identify who those players are this year? And so what I did was I split the data I split it by position to quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end. And so each of them have different variables that are important for the specific variables. So I can actually go ahead and pop the feature importance stuff onto the screen.
Let's do that.
So here it is for quarterbacks. So for quarterbacks, the most important variable is going to be that draft pick. Which makes sense intuitively. And then fantasy points per game from last year. So those two are our two most important variables for the quarterback position. We have an R squared from the model of 48%. And for those of you who aren't as statistics driven as us over at
you could just say you.
48% essentially means that the model is able to explain 48% of the variance in the data. And since there are so many different things that happen during an NFL season, I thought 48% R squared was pretty powerful, especially with a mean absolute error of, for our quarterback position, 3.9.
Was that the highest correlative function?
It was not.
Okay.
The wide receiver model is going to be the best model. And
Sorry to interrupt.
That's okay.
Yeah, we've done a little bit of exploration of R squared and R and charting and predictive analytics like this. So you're not, I guess, talking to a blank wall. The listeners should have a little bit of an understanding of R squared, of predictive analytics, stuff like that. So we wanted to just clear that up and see. Yeah, I don't know. Sorry to interrupt. Basically,
no, that's okay. Did you have any questions about the quarterback model in specific?
Yeah, the draft, the two highest correlative. Oh my God, can't talk. It's early. We're recording this early, so you're gonna have to bear with me here. I am on the West Coast. Was that a Canadian siren I heard, by the way?
No, no, it was not.
Okay.
I
was wondering what that was.
Right by a fire station. So.
Oh, okay. You said in DC?
Yeah, I live in DC. That's right.
Oh, okay, cool. We digress. I didn't think I'd ever heard that siren before. But the two highest correlative pieces for your quarterback model were draft capital, basically. And what was the second one?
This is the season prior's fantasy points per game.
Draft number as in ADP?
No, draft number as in what pick were they in the NFL draft.
Okay, so, yeah. So draft capital. Gotcha.
Exactly. And then years experience was the third one, which makes sense. I think that speaks a little bit to survivorship bias because the quarterbacks that play longer are typically veterans who have been very good in years past. So Tom Brady is probably since Tom Brady has a lot of years of data, he's definitely a driver of that variable popping up like that.
Yeah, dude, that dude is a survivor for sure.
Yep. And then we got rushing attempts per game. So kind of speaks to the rushing upside of fantasy quarterbacks and how important that is for fantasy production.
Yeah. So this past offseason, or I guess earlier this offseason, I did a study for the 33rd team in predictive analytics, and I wanted to basically draw the focus of the fantasy sphere, the industry, back to touchdowns. Mm-hmm. Obviously, they're very hard to predict, but I wanted to find the correlative function of touchdowns versus an expectation for fantasy scoring for each position. And what I found is that touchdowns are the most correlated to fantasy expectation at the quarterback position. I went in with the standard biases of it's probably tight end, it's probably running backs, and it was actually quarterback. And it was an R squared value of 0.69, which is
0.69. Wow.
Yeah, which is almost extreme, right? In a variance-laden contest. Did you kind of find any, I guess, correlative function or importance of touchdowns? Obviously, highly variant. We know this in the game of football, in the game of fantasy football. But how heavy did you weigh the ability to score touchdowns, basically, in this model?
So kind of the amazing thing about XGBoost, which I use the machine learning algorithm, which I use to build this, we don't have to weight any features ourselves. It kind of
tells you,
and it tells us what the model thinks is most important. And that's how this chart was created. Touchdowns it makes sense that touchdowns are going to be the most heavily correlated variable. I think that's tied pretty heavily into the fantasy points per game variable right here, because obviously that's direct relationship. when you mentioned that, I was like looking through these variables and I didn't see touchdowns. And I was just thought to myself, like, why isn't that? And I think it's because, like you said, it's a very variant variable where from year to year, that's going to change a pretty decent amount. So it's difficult to predict next year's fantasy points per game based off of purely last year's touchdown output. I was actually surprised I didn't see it, but I guess thinking about it intuitively, it makes a little bit of sense now.
Yeah, what I found is that over 80% of the touchdowns that are scored in today's NFL game still are scored from within, when the play originated from within the red zone, right?
Right.
So I wanted to explore like offenses that had high sustained drive rate, drive success rate, all that, those kind of different things, and try to predict like the potential touchdown outliers or the regression candidates moving forward to predict or give us a better idea. This is difficult to say because it's so nuanced, right? It's such a nuanced.
It is very nuanced. That's analytics.
Yeah, exactly. You don't want to say something and define it as fact that is trying to be predictive analytics, which is not fact. It's theory. It's
exactly
it's a hypothesis, right? I've wanted to find offenses that would perform better in drive success rate and in red zone touchdown rate as a means to try and predict those touchdown regression candidates. Pretty much the industry is not nailed, but the industry is very savvy now, particularly at the quarterback and the running backs positions where the fantasy potential of a player or an offense is a little bit easier to predict based on obviously what's happened in the past, based on draft capital, all the things that we're seeing on the screen here that you featured in this model. And like Justin Herbert is probably the prime example. Like he's got the offensive coordinator boost this season. He has all the returning pieces. They added Quentin Johnson. It's basically like Kellen Moore is allegedly or supposedly or expected to increase the red zone touchdown rate, expected to increase explosive play rate, all the things that we look for, like when we're trying to predict here. But what I found was most interesting, I think, to me, to kind of counterbalance the biases versus rushing quarterbacks that we kind of, not biases, but it's almost a known fact that like rushing is important at the quarterback position. But what I found is it's probably less important for ceiling expectation than the industry is really believing, in the sense that touchdowns are the most important from a predictive metric for quarterbacks. Obviously, they're very hard to predict. But my model found, or my output found, that it didn't matter where the touchdowns came from at the quarterback position. It's all about scoring touchdowns. So that plays heavier into the offense as a whole, as a more predictive metric for quarterbacks. At least that's what I found. And it kind of gave me the sense that rushing at the quarterback position is important, but probably not as important as the field is placing emphasis on. And this is particularly thinking to ceiling. So the biggest output, or the biggest kind of, I don't even know how to phrase this, the biggest difference in what I found versus how the field is drafting right now are players like Justin Fields, who obviously has that extreme rushing upside, but highly unlikely to pierce the magic touchdown number, which if a quarterback is looking to, or I guess has the potential to score as the overall quarterback one, they're going to need to score at least 40 touchdowns is what I found. And so it can be argued, does Justin Fields in Chicago, even with DJ Moore there, even with the pieces that they added, it can be argued that there might not be the potential for Justin Fields to finish as the overall quarterback one, unless he's passing for 30 touchdowns. Again, only 4 quarterbacks did that last year, and he's rushing for an additional 10 plus. Was there any like outlier function or outlier output that you saw that kind of struck you as this is kind of against the industry? And that was kind of just one example. Dude, I'm like For the listeners, we have not talked about this. We have been like, hey, I'm Josh. Hey, I'm Hilow. Let's talk football. So I'm like totally putting Josh on the spot here. But I think this is an interesting exercise to kind of work through this thought process, what the data is telling us, and what that means theoretically moving forward.
No, I completely agree. Like that's very, very interesting, especially for the Justin Fields point. So Justin Fields is a guy that my model likes, obviously, because of the rushing upside that he offers.
Yeah.
It has him graded out, I think, as QB 5 or 6.
Okay, so around where he's going, yeah.
Yeah, so right around where he's going. But in terms of the actual just going against the field, I think the main the primary model that really like goes against the grain in terms of like ADP versus how my model ranks out is my running back model. We can jump there if you want.
Yeah, let's do that.
My running back model, like the top like 24 is completely different.
Yeah, no, that's huge. Let's do that.
Of ADP. And it's interesting because when I first built my models on season long projections. So like season long fantasy output. And my RB model R squared was like 29%, 33%, something like that. So pretty low. And I think that just speaks more to like the injury variance that occurs at the running back position. So like you're not able to project out fantasy points, total fantasy points across the season for the running back position, as well as the quarterback or the wide receiver position. And then when I took it down to, okay, let's look at running back fantasy points per game, the R squared jumped up from like 30% to 47%. So a pretty big jump in predictive power there in terms of explaining the variance. But the most important feature for this model basically said 2 years ago, it says 2 years ago PPR, but it's 2 years ago half PPR. What was their output 2 years ago? That's going to be pretty predictive, especially I think it's because of those injuries, because of external factors that it wants to take the lens of, let's look at the last 2 years and let's see what that running back production was over the last 2 years, and let's then use that to project out for this next season. And then rushing EPA obviously makes sense. Years experience was an interesting one because in the running back model, so I can show a little bit later down, but it outputs trees for how it makes decisions. And one of those trees is an age, where if they're older than a certain age, it's going to go and give a lesser prediction. If they're younger, then it's going to give a higher prediction. So I thought that was pretty interesting. It's pretty cool that you can kind of follow the tree down and see exactly how the model predicts for every single player.
Yeah, that makes sense too, because of the repeated abuse that these running backs take, obviously between the tackles and it, I guess, did your model like delineate between like a 2-down grinder or like a pass catching back or like a as far as like longevity or like what age? Because that would be an interesting I guess exploration as well. That's just a pure question of curiosity of me.
The model itself doesn't do that. I mean, that's definitely would be a very helpful exercise. I mean, one thing that it does do as part of the tree, though, is it does split by, I think the actual splitter in the tree was like target share or air yard share. That was a pretty big splitter. So I guess through that splitter, it's able to make different decisions if a running back is a pass catching running back versus not.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
But from the output from this model, like it has Josh Jacobs like far and away as the RB1, like which I was pretty shocked by because like I thought that it would definitely spit out Christian McCaffrey since Christian McCaffrey is a fantasy god. But it put Josh Jacobs at like 3 points per game, like clear of RB2 and RB3.
Wow, that's massive.
Which is massive, especially in half PPR. It's kind of crazy.
Half a touchdown.
Yeah, half a
Huge.
touchdown.
That's huge.
And like when I think about it intuitively, like Josh Jacobs, he just continues to produce RB1 fantasy numbers. Like the overall fantasy community kind of pushed him down to what, like ADP of like an RB22 last year. He finished as RB3, massively outproduced that. And then looks like we're doing that again, where Josh Jacobs is what, like RB12.
Yeah. They're doing that, not us. We're not doing that.
No, we're not doing that. I've been drafting a lot of Josh Jacobs right in the third round.
Yeah.
It's kind of wild that he's right in the middle of the third. I know that there's risk around his whole like contract situation, but like those are the types of risky scenarios that I like to value.
Yeah. We'll talk more about that here shortly. Continue. Sorry.
And then there's a few other guys, like Alvin Kamara is another one. Alvin Kamara, my model has him projected out as like RB7 in fantasy points per game.
Okay, and that's points per game. Okay.
Yeah, and fantasy points per game. So like maybe like the suspension, obviously, he can miss the first 6 to 8 weeks, whatever. But when he's healthy, he should be putting up pretty decent numbers. And probably the most interesting thing to me, I ended up adjusting my rankings. So it had Leonard Fournette as RB11 in fantasy points. And I was like, there's no way. So I pushed him down to like RB27, but still he goes in like the 17th, 18th round. Like it's ridiculous that Leonard Fournette, who's I think 27 years old. I know he's got a decent amount of tread on his tires, but he had like 85 targets last season, maybe even more.
So I guess that brings up a good point too. How do you adjust for changes like on an NFL team? So obviously Fournette is not going to be playing with Tom Brady, and I was just going to pull up his stats, Leonard Fournette in particular, because I know Tom Brady's check down rate actually increased a significant amount last season when compared to 2 years ago. So I wanted to kind of tie that loop of the model favoring 2 seasons ago as far as expected fantasy points per game and production. But how did you weight or how did you adjust for? Because I know that's very difficult to input into a statistical model, changes in scheme, coaching, other personnel. How did you adjust for that after the output, or did you?
So when I was building the model, I did include like a new team question mark variable. Okay. So that would hopefully try to capture any sort of change of production based off of a change in situation. Obviously, the model didn't think that was important for any of the positions, but maybe I probably need to do a little bit more work on the changing scenarios. But for the after model output adjustments that I made, if you see this mean MAE. So for running backs, it was 2.8. Essentially what I did was I adjusted the fantasy points per game within the bounds of the mean absolute error. So like Leonard Fournette, for example, he was projected like 11.7 points. I was like, a lot of things are changing. He's getting pushed way down. Like I'll subtract 2.8 points from Leonard Fournette, just to keep it within the bounds of the mean absolute error. And just because like they push them down to like RB27, he goes as like RB like 70 anyway. So like I'll keep drafting him. So whatever. But let's take Tony Pollard, for example. Tony Pollard is now the RB1 in Dallas. Ezekiel Elliott, who got like 250 carries last season, he's gone. So a lot of opportunity is open for Tony Pollard. I adjusted him up like I think 1.4, maybe 1.8 points, because it's within the bounds of the mean absolute error. And then he gets a boost because of the situation. And that's how I ended up deciding on my final rankings, was using the bounds of the mean absolute error and then adjusting based on how impactful I thought that the actual change was. I probably could have been a little bit more scientific about that, but I kind of just went off vibes.
Yeah. Strong vibes.
Strong vibes.
Talk to me a little bit about what mean absolute error is. Is that tied to like a function like standard deviation? So I'm not familiar. I'm not that great at coding and at predictive analytics through R. I have enough to get by and understand what I'm doing, but I'm not familiar with mean absolute error. So talk to me real quick about what that is and why it's important.
Of course. So we split all of our data into a training and a testing set. So it was like 66% of the data we used to train the model. 34% of the data we use to validate the model's predictions. The mean absolute error is the error bars, essentially. So across all of the different predictions versus the actuals, when you subtract that, it's essentially the mean of the residuals.
Okay.
So prediction minus actual, that's going to be the error bar. And then if you take the mean of all of those error bars, that is what the mean absolute error is.
Okay. So heavier variance and is that most useful in adjusting, or is that going to be different for each position? Is that going to be okay?
It is different for each position. So we saw the quarterback was 3.9.
Okay.
So the quarterback is actually the most variant.
Yeah.
Which I think makes sense.
Interesting. Yeah, touchdowns.
The quarterbacks make score the most points, and they're going to be the most variant because of touchdowns, like you said. And then for running backs, it's 2.8. My best model was wide receivers. We can jump down to that if you'd like.
That's interesting. We'll hit that here in a minute. Yeah.
Okay.
Because I found that was the most difficult for me to analytically or statistically predict. So yeah, I'm highly interested in seeing that.
Of course. But okay. Any other questions on the running back model?
I wanted to bring up the point that it makes sense to me analytically, or I guess and theoretically, that the model prefers data from 2 seasons ago from a fantasy points per game mindset, because that allows things like injuries time to settle. And we've seen the impact of major ligament damage, Achilles issues, pretty much your major injuries at running back position. It's almost a 20 to 22% impact on fantasy expectation per game in the first year coming back, which then kind of approaches the pre-injury levels in year 2. So that's interesting, at least to me as well.
Yeah, that's why I was surprised at first too, when 2 years ago half PPR was the thing that popped out the most for the running back position. But like you said, like the more you think about it, the more intuitive it becomes. Mm-hmm. I'm curious though, because you bring up a great point about RB injuries. What do you think about Breece Hall this season? Because 2 years ago PPR, like we don't have that variable for Breece Hall.
We have pre-injury and that's about it. Yeah, so I actually did a lot of work into Breece Hall because I think he is one of the most, probably we'll say, enigmatic running backs this season, because his pre-injury output was so elite and his metrics were off the chart. But it's like we have this, I called it a catch-22, I think, where it's like we have this singular data point that's pulling us in 2 different directions, where he was so elite prior to the injury, and then we know the 20 to 22%, depending on age, function, all these different inputs that go into describing the fantasy expectation post-injury in year 1. Right. It's very, very interesting. And my conclusion was, I don't know, it could be anywhere. His range of outcomes is probably one of the wider range of outcomes in as far as fantasy points per game goes. Okay. And we could see, I mean, it's feasibly possible for us to see almost like a certain data point almost all displayed across the entire range of outcomes as far as individual week fantasy points per game, or I don't know, that's kind of redundant, but because I think that it's entirely possible that by the end of the season, he's putting up like routine top 5 scores at the position, but it might take 6, 8, 12 weeks to get there based on he was so young when he got injured. It was a major injury. There were no other associated ligament damage. So there's a lot of positives that kind of go into his particular outlook. But I think we're going to see a start slow kind of thing output, and then it just really picks up once he and like I've never torn my ACL. Like I played sports, I played soccer for 18 years of my life, but like I don't know. I don't know other than like asking the people who do know, the trainers, the doctors in the room, and a lot of them are highly optimistic with him. So I kind of just have to take that at face value as if I'm really trying to analyze that. But my conclusion was dude, here's the positives, here's the negatives. You guys make the decision. And I want, especially considering his ADP in the 3rd round right now, I think you have to want exposure at that price.
Yeah. I have a decent amount of Breece Hall.
So I was going to ask, you go now.
My model loves Breece Hall.
Yeah.
It just took the data that we do have on Breece Hall and basically identified him as one of those elite running backs. It has him like a half point behind Christian McCaffrey.
Where did Christian McCaffrey output? You mentioned him earlier. Where was
he?
He
RB3. He was RB3. He basically had the exact same output as RB2.
RB2 is Eckler?
Joe Mixon.
Joe Mixon. Ooh,
Joe Mixon.
Spicy.
Yeah. Spicy, right? Spicy. Like when I saw it, I was like, ooh, that's kind of crazy. But
yeah.
Part
Talk
of
about touchdown variance.
Yeah.
Joe Mixon is probably the poster boy for touchdown variance.
It really is.
He had like 15 carries inside the 5, and he resulted in like only touchdowns in his 5 touchdown game. Like did not score inside the 5 outside of that game. It's insane. Anyway, we digress.
But
yeah.
Back to Breece. Yeah.
Back to Breece. Because dude, I think Breece is one of those players where he has the opportunity to just completely wreck in fantasy this year. And he also has the opportunity to really, really disappoint. And I think that's reflected in his current ADP in the 3rd round. I think he would probably be steamed to around where Tony Pollard, kind of his trajectory as far as ADP movement, if he didn't have that injury. Very, very similar profiles, I think.
Yeah, I can mostly agree. I think that if Breece didn't have that injury, I think he'd actually go in the 1st round.
Yeah. I think that's where Tony's going, man. I think that's where Pollard's going. He would have to unseat Bijan, I think, because people are just not wanting to draft running backs in the 1st. But yeah,
kind of crazy.
Yeah.
I've been drafting. So I got early on in Best Ball Mania season, I was doing just a bunch of like hero RB and 0 RB teams because that's what I won last year. And then the more I drafted, I was like, these running backs in the 2nd and 3rd round, I can't keep passing these guys up. So I started to draft a bunch of those guys.
When did you start drafting?
I started drafting in like early May. It was like
okay. So when the contest opened, like a couple days after the contest opened.
Yeah, a couple days after the contest opened. That's right.
We've talked about the theoretics behind that, and I was doing the same, and I was forcing that because you were able to get Joe Mixon in the 7th round. You were able to get Antonio Gibson in the 12th, 13th round. Sometimes
I got him crazy.
Yeah. So the ability to take the data that is present to us, and primarily we factor into this decision-making process in best ball, we utilize the governing function, which is ADP, right? Being able to analyze and predict the macro changes, we'll say, in where we expect those trends to go in the future is highly, highly important, because that led me to, like you, basically saying, like, I can build these teams that I'm probably never going to be able to build again throughout the rest of the draft season right now because of Joe Mixon, because of Alexander Madison's, because of Antonio Gibson's and Rashad Penny and all these backs that on a point per game basis are expected to be elite, but they have all these uncertainty, I guess, functions regarding their profile because they're either in ambiguous situations or changing teams or yada, yada. The list goes on, right? Joe Mixon was being depressed because of his legal issues, which may or may not still be a thing, but kind of all ties into this idea that, like, identifying where the field is at now as far as macro landscape is and where it's likeliest to go gives you the ability to change your approach in drafts. And we should not be static in our approach from the day the contest opens to the end where ADP is supposedly going to be more accurate. We have more information. All these variables that go into, like, our decision-making matrix are going to change. So we should not be static in our approach, and we should look to push edges and expected value dependent on where in the draft cycle we are. Quick thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. The way that I look at the current best ball landscape is it's essentially a market. and which players are we willing to buy or sell at certain prices. And like you said, early on in the offseason, I was drafting a bunch of zero RB, hero RB teams because I could get Joe Mixon, James Conner.
Yes, Connor's a good one. Good show.
Antonio Gibson, Damian Harris, all these guys DeAndre Swift, like all these guys just like much later in the draft. Could grab Leonard Fournette in the last round. Like it's been.
You're a Leonard Fournette guy. You're painting that on your back, man. That's bold. You got to be able to live with the output.
Hey, I'll do it. I'll take all of the 18th round Leonard Fournette that I can get because he's going to sign somewhere. He's going to sign somewhere. My prediction, and it might be a little bit of just like very wishful thinking, but my prediction is he signs with the Kansas City Chiefs. That would shoot his ADP way up, and I'll have all of the closing line ADP value in the world on Leonard Fournette. But in terms of just like, we have to be adjusting to the market. And as like the current best ball landscape kind of looks like, I know in previous years, we've had this RB dead zone between rounds like 3 to 8. It was just like an RB dead zone because all of the running backs were taken in the elite running backs were taken in the first and second round.
Yeah.
I feel like it's kind of flip-flopped where now it's like a wide receiver dead zone.
Where would you say that dead zone starts this year?
For wide receiver, I would say like the third round to the fifth, early sixth, all feels like a flat tier to me.
Yeah. So I've identified the same thing, and how I've described it is probably that middle to late third round is the RB hill. And then the end of the 8th round, so your JMOs, your Rashad Batemans, is probably the wide receiver. Did I say RB? The wide receiver cliff. So there's like a gradual, like exactly like you described it, is like there's this gradual or flattening third round, middle of the third to late third. And then you approach the cliff, and then it's like Mariana's Trench after like the 8th round. Is that kind of like how you're seeing it as well?
Yeah. Almost exactly the same. It's pretty incredible how the market has corrected from years past, and now the entire like positional, what's the word? I guess the positional dead zone is kind of like switched between running backs and wide receivers. I have this cool little chart here.
We like charts.
If I could share. I've posted this on Twitter a few times, but this is, so on the x-axis, we have Best Ball Mania 4 ADP, and on the y-axis, we have my model's fantasy points per game predictions. And as we can see, the market is very efficient. These green dots are all of the wide receivers. Yep. It's very efficient in predicting where certain wide receivers should be going. So it starts off with all of the elite guys go in like the first like 2 rounds. They're all gone by the first 2 rounds. And then it just gradually flattens off. And you maybe get like a little bit of a bump, but like this tier right here between picks like 25 to like 60, it's like a flat tier.
Super flat. Yeah. That's
interesting. Yeah, super flat. Whereas versus running backs, we see all of these spikes. Like there's like the running back market seems a little bit inefficient. And it's why I'm drafting all of the running backs in the third round, third round, or I guess less so in the second, more so I'm drafting all the running backs in the third round.
Yeah.
But
I would have to concur. Do you have who these outliers? So like we'll use wide receiver. There's a couple of spikes as we start getting later. Do you have the names of those data points?
Yeah. I do. So this is ADP of 1. So these 2 right here are Zay Jones and Jacoby Myers.
Okay.
That's who the model is very favorable on.
Who's that around 100 ADP?
Around 1.
He's
around 100
super up there. Yeah, he's super up there.
Are you talking about this one right here? That running back?
Oh, that's a running back.
That's Alvin Kamara.
Okay.
That's Alvin Kamara right there. Yeah. That's a blue dot. I guess, yeah, it is a little bit harder to see on the screen. Maybe I'll make my dots a little bit different. I think what I'm planning to do, though, is turn this into a smoother curve. So it could give us like a very good idea of like how the market right now is a little bit inefficient in projecting running backs, whereas for wide receivers, it's almost perfectly efficient for predicting how the wide receivers are going to project out.
Yeah, that's super interesting.
But yeah, that's this. I feel like this is a pretty solid edge, and like this was my whole onus behind building this model was so I could gain edges like this, being able to identify where the market is wrong, and where we can find our competitive edge against the market. So
that's basically, in a nutshell, explains exactly why I got into game theory. And a lot of my work in game theory is just basically self-help, growth.
Right.
I started just basically coming from DFS. I was like, well, the field is approaching this level of hyper efficiency as far as roster construction, as far as player evaluation, as far as the models are getting better to predict median projections and ranges of outcomes. Where is the edge moving forward? And that's what got me into game theory. So love the theoretical and the hypotheses that is required to then arrive at what's next. And that's almost like that's what we do at 1 week season. And that's why we're always trying to stay a year, 2 years ahead of the field and see where the game is going, which I think is extremely important to kind of stay ahead here.
I completely agree. Even after like building these sorts of models and having this output, having this edge, there's still a lot of questions that remain unanswered and keep me up at night. The biggest one is like look at the quarterback projections. Like the quarterback line is probably just like going to be super spiky, just all over the place. But for the top performing quarterbacks, it's pretty efficient. Where like all of these dots up here in the top left, they're all up there, and like Josh Allen is like far and ahead, like the top quarterback. But like the question remains, like, okay, should I be drafting Josh Allen though? Since like I know since he's the most likely to finish as quarterback 1 and he gets drafted as the quarterback 3, is that my edge? Or do I wait until pick 100 or pick 150 and go for like a late 3 quarterback sort of build? So I've been kind of mixing my builds and trying to do like some more Josh Allen, some more late 3 quarterback build, and making sure that I get this data point right here, which is Daniel Jones. So, and then this one back here is Kyler, but I adjusted him down because of the ACL. Obviously, we don't know he's going to be back, but
So that is what we're trying to do here on this podcast. That what you're explaining is like the mix between what the data is telling us and how we utilize that data theoretically to maximize our expected value. That's I love it. I love that discussion. I think the answer, to that or that question you posed is probably yes. So like both. It's got to be both, right? Because the end of this contest has such a strong, not resemblance, but like it's more tailored to what we would see for like a small field DFS contest where we have to beat 16 players. We have to finish first to advance, and we have to do that back-to-back weeks. And now we're in this like single entry small field contest, 441 players. Well, it's like, we don't know sitting here in whenever you were building this model or whenever we were, we'll say early May, right after the NFL draft, we don't know, like, we don't have a time machine. We can't go. And you mentioned this earlier, and I saw this in your work on Twitter as well, that like the most important thing is drafting the right players, the players that score the most points. It's like, we don't know. We don't have that time machine, but what we're trying to do is take what we do know, which is the models, the previous stats, the must-haves, we'll say. And you described the must-haves very, very similarly to how I have in the past, which is like stacking and correlation. So we know what that does to expected value from the Best Ball Manifesto, from Mike Golioni, from my own works. We know closing line value versus ADP is important, and we know roster construction is important. But that is basically where the field is just hyper-focused right now. And in my opinion, those are the baseline foundational elements of best ball. Those are what we must have to be competitive. Those are like having a model 3 years ago in DFS. Like you had to have some sort of predictive function to be competitive in this game. Where's it going in the future? What is the field not doing now? And that's where I think is important to understand what the data is telling us, bounce it off of the constraining factors of the contest we're playing, knowing that it's cumulative scoring in the first 14 weeks, and then it basically devolves into this single week contest, weeks 15, 16, and 17. How do we theoretically optimize for that, which is something that the field is highly unlikely to be utilizing at a similar rate to the must-haves? So were there, as you're staying up late at night, as you're figuring out, like, what is this telling me? How do I utilize this? What are some of the things that you have basically found from your model and from the theoretics of this contest, and as ways forward?
I still have not answered that question yet.
Nice. I think that's probably the best answer there is, because we don't know. All we're doing is trying to theoretically analyze or blend these theoretics and these analytics to place ourselves in the best position to realize expected value through variance, through all the things that go into this crazy, crazy contest we're playing. Yeah, I love that answer. It's like,
I mean, exactly. We have nothing to go off of to say whether we're right or wrong, because we have all these hypotheses, all these theories, and so we're trying to put them into action into each of our drafts, and then we're not going to know which is the correct hypothesis until January, I guess this late December, early January, when this contest finally ends. So I have some thoughts. I have a few routes which I'm trying to go down.
Do you want to talk about those?
Yeah, we can. I mean, it's mostly just my primary hypothesis is like inefficiencies in the market, and I'm just trying to take advantage of that. Like basically saying, okay, wide receivers are efficient, running backs are not. Let's take advantage of that. Quarterbacks are kind of efficient, but there are some quarterbacks later on that we could take advantage of. Let's take advantage of that as well. So my primary hypothesis is like, okay, I know in the past, like people have said, okay, like ADP is a pretty good indicator, or like ADP is like how you should be thinking about the market. And I don't necessarily think that that's true. I think there are edges to be gained. Like ADP is like, it's consensus. It's like what everybody thinks. And I think especially like, I know like growing up, I was in like home fantasy football leagues, and like we would all draft in person. And if someone drafts someone way in front of ADP, we're all going to shit on them and all going to yell at them. So it's like a peer pressure sort of thing. It's this entire like
psychology of interacting agents, which is fascinating.
Exactly. It's very fascinating. And for that reason, like people are afraid to click on certain names because it's going to be 10, 12 picks ahead of ADP. So like, oh, I don't want to feel stupid. So I'm going to go ahead and just draft the guy that's at the top of the board because he's the guy that the market is telling me that I should be drafting.
Look at this value I'm getting.
Yeah, like exactly. So that was like a big question that I had. And I was exploring like, okay, we have an understanding of closing line value. A closing line value obviously has a decent predictive factor for your success in the actual season. Mm-hmm. The question that I had was not on closing line value, but more so on ADP value at the time of draft.
Yes,
so
dude.
That's one thing that I explored. And I found that the highest performing teams were the teams that had 0 ADP value as a team. So the total ADP value across the entire team was 0. And I actually have another chart that I can show.
Ooh, look at our chops.
Let's see. I think that I included this one in the okay. So let me pull this up. Based off the feedback that I received on that Twitter thread, I adjusted my ADP value chart. And so this is every single Best Ball Mania 3 team. Every single Best Ball Mania team from last year. And on the y-axis, we have the regular season roster points. And on the x-axis, we have adjusted ADP value. And I adjusted the ADP value to follow that Mike Leone ADP value curve.
The buckets.
Yeah. Not the buckets, the curve that went like this and it allocated. Okay. So most draft capital is for the first few picks, and then it's like a negative exponential chart. But the average ADP value of a Best Ball Mania 3 playoff team was 0.15. So I was basically taking that, and it's like, okay, if I know this guy is going to, let's say who's a good example? Let's take Brandon Ayuk, for example. Brandon Ayuk has right now an ADP of like
early 5th, something like that.
Is he 55 now?
Yeah, let me see.
Okay, so Brandon Ayuk was a little bit of a better example when it was a little bit earlier in the offseason when he was going around like 64. Whenever he was around like 64, whenever I saw Brandon Ayuk on the board in the 5th round, I was hitting the draft button on him. So I have a lot of Brandon Ayuk from early in the offseason, but recently I haven't been drafting as much Brandon Ayuk because
51 ADP, something like that.
51. So he just keeps moving up and up and up. But maybe I was the one who was pushing up, but not really. But Brandon Ayuk was someone that I was reaching like 10, 12 picks on ADP because I love Brandon Ayuk. I think Brandon Ayuk is a phenomenal player. He ranks out really well in my model. And so I was drafting a lot of Brandon Ayuk 12 picks ahead of ADP. Based off this chart, that's basically telling me, okay, I have to, and one of my later picks, I need to be grabbing a guy 10 to 12 picks after ADP. So I'm going to be drafting some of the dudes that are falling down the board, even though I might not love them as much. As long as, like, if let's say they have a little bit of correlation with my team, I'll go ahead and just hit the draft button on them. Just because I want to stay around that 0 ADP value. It's okay to be slightly negative, but as we can see, like being positive, even in the hundreds, doesn't necessarily give you a massive advantage. It's more so you want to build your team the correct way and draft the right players.
That makes sense because if you think about it analytically, the drafts that you are able to create ADP values in the hundreds are super, super early, and we know the pitfalls of that as well. As far as having active players come the playoff time, come the end of the season, we know things like the heavy variance that's associated with drafting so early. As far as being able to, we don't have the information for a lot of positional battles, stuff like that. Injuries have not happened. So that makes sense that it is more so something that should go into the decision-making process and not the end-all be-all of the decision-making process, which is like just trying to fit as much closing line value versus ADP as we can on a roster.
Yep.
That's cool to see. That was something that we have theoretically explored, so it's cool to see that in the data. I had not seen this yet.
Yeah, I like my hypothesis was that like, oh, more ADP value, more points you're going to score, and I was surprised that isn't necessarily true. Like even this team that scored the most points in the regular season,
it's like they were at like ADP,
30 ADP, like not a ton. So you just drafted the right players.
It is also interesting to see that heavier concentration about 0, right? Like for the playoff teams, we kind of have that little spike there in the middle.
Yep, exactly.
Super interesting. Yeah, I think that's also a function and makes sense intuitively again because the ADP scene is changing, and that's why being able to identify where are we at, where are we going, and being able to stay ahead of that market, like you talked about, like I brought up as well, is extremely important in this game because you're not going to be able to create the same teams that you were able to create in August, in September, that you can in May and June. Obviously, there's goods and bads of both of those, and those are the extremes. Obviously, the more time elapses, the more information we have as far as ADP, the more information we have as far as each individual team, camp battles, injuries, more information, but it's a sliding scale. And I think the field is more like ones and zeros. It's like, I know what I know right now, and I'm going to draft like I know best right now. It's like, well, that's a very binary way to look at this game that is all about ranges of outcomes, sliding scales, whether it's variance, whether it's information, whether it's ADP. Like it's just a sliding scale, and there's no answer that there's no timestamp within those sliding scales that's better or worse than one or the other. It's just we have to understand how do we change our approach to maximize along that sliding scale. Are you still there?
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
I am still here.
Sick.
I saw that you froze.
Yeah. My entire computer is frozen right now, so we'll see how that's going to work. I think we'll just continue discussing. Oh, we're back. Oh, kind of. All right, we'll just continue discussing, and I think I'm just going to remain frozen. But we have got about 5 minutes left, something like that.
All right.
Anything closing, parting shots? We kind of anchored pretty heavily there on your model, on the outputs, on what it means, and the theoretical components of moving forward. Anything else that you found as striking that you wanted to talk about before we get out of here?
Anything that I found as striking? I think the most striking thing from my data exploration was just how important it is to draft the right players. Like, if you draft the right players, these are the closing thoughts I'll have. There was a guy who made the finals last year with 4 wide receivers. He went 3-7-4-4 was his build.
Okay.
And because he drafted Justin Jefferson and Tyreek Hill, he was able to make the finals, which is just that's just wild to me. Like, that you could draft 4 wide receivers on your team and make the finals is absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
So that's just kind of just speaks to the importance of, like, how important it is to draft the right players. Like, yes, he didn't win the finals. So if we're looking to win the finals, you obviously do not want to draft only 4 wide receivers on your team. But I think that highlights really, really well just the impact of just drafting the right players, like what that can do for you. And then add on everything else that we know, add in the roster construction, the ADP value, the stacking, the correlation, add all of that on top of drafting the right players. You got yourself $1 million winning team.
There you go. Looks like, oh my God, froze again. It's like stopped my webcam now. So I'm like on my freaking HD camera on my laptop. It's like, what is going on here? Anyway, there we go. Popping me back out. Yeah, dude, this was super, super informative. This was super interesting to kind of have that discussion of the analytics, the theoretics, and how we can marry those moving forward to, factor into our decision-making process. Before we get out of here, why don't you tell the listeners again, where can they find you? Where can they find your work? Shout out your Twitter handle, and then we'll get out of here, man.
Of course. You guys can follow me on Twitter at Joshua J. Hyun. That is JoshuaJaehyun on Twitter. And I post all of the insights that I gave to you guys today. That's you can find that all pinned to my Twitter profile. And if you scroll down a little bit, you'll be able to see the actual model build. The model outputs will be available on the Undroppables website at theundroppables.com. Be posting that sometime this week, hopefully before this episode goes out. So, really looking forward to it.
That's awesome, man. Appreciate you for pushing the boundaries, because obviously it was striking enough to me to ask you to come on the show. So keep doing that, man. That's awesome to see. And we might have to run this back because there was a lot of stuff that we wanted to talk about that we didn't even get to today. So appreciate you coming on. Josh, again, follow him on Twitter. Go check out his work at Undroppables. And with that, we will see you in the draft lobbies, and we will see you